Hello, everybody. Do you recognize me? I'm going to take this off because I don't really need it right now. I'm at home alone with my cat, so it's only the two of us. But I wanted to start with the mask just to illustrate the changes that have taken place in the world over the last year. And this is a special podcast because it is the 1 year anniversary of Nutty Professor podcasts. They started off as podcasts from the edge, and then they turned into We're All Strugglers at the Edge podcasts about 3 or 4 podcasts ago. Now, talking about masks, I have another one. And this one is, you go like this, and you pull it up. It's really a tube. It's called a tube, an active tube style mask. I got it at Canadian Tire and sale. I'm sorry, I can't wear this out into public. I look like a nutty bank robber. I don't need these right now. As I said, I'm at home. Now, a little bit more about masks since I've started talking about them. I did actually get a mask about a month and a half ago when all this started. My former student, who is now also my producer and my editor, he's a big proponent of these things. And he kept saying, Prof, you must get masks every time you go out. You must wear a mask. And at the time, some people said they help, some said they don't help, and so some people were saying don't wear cloth masks. Then they started saying you should wear cloth masks, and there's been a lot of back and forth. Now, and I'm not saying I believe this, but now there's even people, some fringe group, is saying that wearing a mask actually triggers the thing. As I said, I don't buy that, but there's a whole rage. So what I did was I had a mask, and I bought some more. I got a packet, but I had a mask, and every time I went out, I would wrap it up in a paper towel, put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, and I would go out in the car by myself. I'd go stand on the lines, on the marks to go shopping, and it wasn't a rule. Some people wore masks, some people didn't, and if anybody had ever asked me, I would have said yes, I have one. And the first time it actually happened, yesterday, I went to an Asian supermarket, and there wasn't a lineup, but I went to the door, and the employee wearing a mask said, "Sir, you can't come in unless you have a mask. Do you have a mask?" And I said, "I just so happen to have one in my pocket here." I put it on, and my glasses fogged up, and it was kind of weird reading in the thing. And I shopped for about 5 minutes. There wasn't really anything there I wanted, so I left. And then I went to Sobeys a little later, and I stood in line, and it was about 50% of people, customers had masks, and 50% didn't. And I got to the front, and I asked the guy, I said, do I need to wear it? I do have one of these things. And he said, it's optional. He said, if you want to wear it, you can wear it, but you don't have to, And I followed the arrows. I kept the 2-meter distance from other people, and so I didn't wear it. So this is now going to be my personal, and this, I'm not recommending this for anyone else, but my own personal Nutty Prof policy is I will always keep one on me, and I will wear it when required or when asked. Now, this whole thing of carrying around a mask and reminded me of something sort of, how young men sometimes, so I've heard, carry around a condom in their wallet just in case you ever need it, and I guess it's kind of like that. It's also protection, different kind of protection, But so that's the whole mask thing. As I said, it's 1 year since we started these podcasts. And when we started them, the intention was to provide an alternate approach to 12-step groups, because I found that 12 steps groups did not work for me personally. And I tried to come up with an alternative, which I called PATAP, personalized approach to addictions process, and it was a work in progress. It was a journey, and I was not recommending it to anyone else. It was what worked for me, what didn't work for me. And in that very first podcast, I talked about why 12-step approaches don't seem to work for me. And I provided some background about myself. I talked about my names and my Nutty Prof persona. And I had this persona when I was teaching, but I didn't actually have a logo. The logo and the hat and the glasses. And it looks like this, the logo was designed by my editor at the time. And now we have the Nutty Prof logo, and my former student, who is now my editor and producer, he calls me Prof. And all of his friends who've helped with the podcast and his girlfriend, they all call me Prof. And I like Nutty Prof, so NP for short, it's kind of become a persona that I'm using a lot again. And we did talk about persona. It's interesting, we've also talked about how the word for persona actually came from the Greek word for mask, and personas showed up in Jungian theory. So in that first podcast, I did talk about, my names, I gave a background, and I provided some frameworks, literary, philosophical, psychological. And these are the frameworks that we have used throughout the year in the 24 podcasts. And in that very first one I mentioned, William S. Burroughs, who is a writer. He wrote Junkie. It was one of his famous books, and he would use the term junkie for addicts. And we've talked about language and thought and who can use terms and what they mean, and we've had a couple of podcasts on them. So on language and thought. So he used the term junkie. It was the title of one of his books. He also his famous book was Naked Lunch. And he was a heroin addict himself, and he struggled on and off throughout his life with it. And I've talked about other substances, not particularly heroin, but we talked about Burroughs. We talked about Carrie Fisher, and she was another one of my influences. I think everyone knows she was an actor, also a writer, very good writer. She wrote about her own experiences with addiction and with bipolar, and her name also came up in connection with Star Wars because she was in the movie, and I've talked about Star Wars in terms of the symbolism in it, and we've looked at it from a Jungian perspective with shadow and persona and all of that stuff, and I've got a podcast on that. So we talked about Burroughs, talked about Carrie Fisher, and there are some other beats. Burroughs is a beat writer, and we in later podcasts I did talk about Allen Ginsberg, and in a later podcast I quoted one of his famous poems, Howl. I've seen the best minds of my generation starving, naked, hysterical in the street. I quoted it, and we were talking about the Nutty Prof trying not to go crazy or psycho, So, and he was talking about a whole generation that kind of went of intellectuals who did substances who went kind of psycho. So, and we also talked a little bit about in an earlier podcast, not the very first, but in maybe fourth or fifth podcast, I did mention Nietzsche, who was classified as an existentialist. And at that time, we talked about him in connection with his very famous quote about how if you stare too long into the abyss stares back at you, And in later podcasts, particularly after COVID happened, we went back to the existentialists, not so much Nietzsche, but Sartre and Camus. Particularly Camus, because Camus wrote a book called The Plague, which is very prescient. And a lot of people are talking about it right now. And existentialism deals with looking for meaning in the face of death. So that's been a framework. And the psychological frameworks, as I mentioned, Jungian, shadow. We've got a couple of podcasts on shadow, on Jung's shadow and confronting and integrating, so on. And Freud. ego, superego, and eros and thanatos has come up quite a bit, ego defense mechanisms. So we introduced some of that. Not all of those perspectives, but some of those in the first podcast. And I did start talking about my own approach, which is based on some theoretical perspectives, but mostly based on my own experience, my own observations, my own experience. And as I said, it's personalized. It was, what worked for me, what didn't work for me was a, work in progress. And I called it, as I said, PATAP. So now, in terms of my struggles, and I came up with language, tried to be non-judgmental. So rather than clear, rather than recovering addict, turning back struggler, rather than addict, non-turning back struggler. And the non-strugglers were called civilians. I actually got that term from Burroughs himself. That's what he called non-junkies. So we worked on all of that, and I would at first I would say so many weeks clean, and I said fell, and then I didn't want to provide too many details. I wanted to keep some stuff a bit more personal, but I did mention the struggles, and I did mention when things got bad. And the good news is that I have now been clear in my terms, for several months, and I kind of had the last episode back in January, and it was pretty bad. And then after that, I really put everything I had into it, and I started, rechanneling. It's one of my methods of dealing with it from PATAP, and at that time, going out to see movies. Now I can't do that. But I started volunteering at cat shelter and various things, and writing and reading and all of that. And I put everything I had into it, and I made it to COVID starting, and then after that, I've still been clear. And I think it's going to vary from person to person, but for me, for the most part, COVID, the emergency, the self-isolation, it's probably helped me, stay clear. And I've got a couple of new concepts that I want to add here. I call them push and pull. So I still feel, even all these months later, all this time later, I still feel a pull, and I'm in isolation. I still feel the pull, but I now there are pushes. So there's a pull and there's pushes against it, and the whole, for those people who are struggling with bars are closed, and I don't drink at home. I wasn't for a while anyway, because for me, booze was more of a controlled burn. It wasn't the main substance, And then again, casinos are closed, for people who are struggling with that. Now, the other substances. And as I said, I've been clear quite a few months now. And I was clear before COVID, and I've been clear during COVID, but I've been hearing about the underworld, and I've been reading about it, and it's getting the non-turning back strugglers. Remember in an earlier podcast I talked about how somebody had said I was a tourist in that world, or I had said actually I'm a tourist, and somebody else said no, you got a passport. Well, at least I had a passport. A lot of people who are not turning back, who are stuck there, who are daily users, they don't have passports, and I've been reading about how it's very tough now because people are going into withdrawal. Some people, the substances are getting much harder to get. Closed borders, seizures, vigilance of law enforcement, social distancing, and danger of infection in that world, people not wiping everything down like in supermarkets, it's become very, very dangerous, but the people that can't come back, the daily users, are stuck and are taking a lot of risks, and there's robbery, I hear, and there's arrests, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. I was able to go clear, and I was not a daily user, but it's still not. It's been difficult. It's still been kind of difficult. There are the pushes, against the polls. A friend of mine, a former colleague, I was talking about this with her the other day via text, and when she found out, and she'd been very worried about me, and when she found out I've been clear for several months, and COVID has actually sort of helped in a way. She said, "Oh, there are some silver linings to this pandemic," and I've heard other people say that in terms of less pollution and traffic and this and that, and people introverting and insights. And I've heard people say silver linings. I don't know about my going clear as a silver lining. Maybe a copper lining. So, but it is good news. I am following the rules of self-isolation. I'm not seeing my analyst anymore in person. We're doing it online. We have trouble with that. We end up on the phone, we're both kind of Luddites. I mentioned that in the last podcast. And I do really miss going out to see movies. I'd go by myself, but still, I'd get out of the house and it's in the cinema, and I didn't have that. And I used to go out to eat a lot, and I've been substituting. I've been cooking at home, and now I'm getting some takeout occasionally. So I have been substituting. I have been writing, been reading to a certain degree. I've still been doing these podcasts, but doing them remotely, thanks to my former student. So the one thing that I have been kind of going out to do occasionally, not a lot, but following all the protocols besides grocery shopping, is, I mentioned before, the volunteering to help cats. And there was a shelter that I started volunteering for, and it turned out they needed drivers. And that was perfect for me because, I have several vehicles I love to drive, and I love cats, and I want to help cats. And it's a very positive rechanneling of energy for me. And, cats are still in trouble. They haven't done anything wrong, and the actual adoption center has been closed down temporarily. It was in a pet store, but the shelter is still operating. There's emergency cases, and cats are found, and people pass away, and there are 4 or 5 cats, and they're taken by the shelter. They're taken to a vet, the shelter vet, which is kind of out of town, and the vet checks them out and does all the vaccines and all of that stuff, and then they find foster homes, and they find adoptive homes, and sometimes the foster parents, ones who live downtown, don't have a car, so they call on volunteer drivers, and there I am, the Nutty Professor, and I'm like, and following all the rules. I mentioned this in a previous podcast, where I'd go to pick up a rescue cat from the vets, and they'd bring them out to the sidewalk, put them on the sidewalk in the case. I pick up the case, I put them in the backseat of the car, I talk to the cat when I'm driving, and it's in the backseat, and I'm going, look, I know you're going to be looked after. I know this organization. I go, they don't F around. I said, yeah, you're going to get a really good foster home, and then an adoptive home, and you're getting a really good second chance here, and they're kind of looking at me, this guy's saying, nuts, But and then I get to the foster home, I call, I get out of the car, I step back 10 feet, and the person comes, opens the back door of the car, takes the case, takes the cat, we wave each other from 10 feet away, and, and they're usually very excited to see the cats. It's wonderful. And, I do recommend if you can. I mean, if you're by yourself and you're in isolation and you don't have a pet and you're willing to foster. I mean, it's not for everyone, but if you can, it would be much appreciated. And these people, I'm really impressed with the kind of work they do, the dedication they have, and people are looking after sick cats and they're getting medication and they're giving medication, and it's just amazing that people have stepped up in these times. So I've been busy with that. In an earlier podcast, I did talk about a tarot reading I had done before all of this. She didn't actually predict COVID, but one of the cards that I selected was about the world card was about helping others and volunteering, and at the time didn't occur to me that I'd be helping cats during a global pandemic. I actually, as a bit of a joke, I sent a mini bio to a friend of mine. I mentioned him in an earlier podcast. He's the dog metaphor guy. But I was exchanging texts with him, and he said, "Oh, you can put cat chauffeuring on your resume." And I said, "I'm not going to be applying for any jobs or anything. I've given up teaching, and that's done. But I still want to publish. I have a lot of manuscripts, and I've been working on. I've got the hundreds of pages each about my experiences in the underworld and with addiction, and sometimes I call them junkie stories. And I've got hundreds and hundreds of pages of my manuscripts, and I've been working on them. I was getting closer to trying to publish, but all of this has happened. I started to send out query letters, but I put it on hold again for now. When all this is over, we'll get back to that. But so just as a joke, I sent him my friend a mini bio. If I ever do get around to publishing, I don't know how much say I get on what my bio for my back cover is, but for my back cover, I'm going to have something like former professor, podcaster, aspiring writer, a lerophile, fancy way of saying cat person, bibliophile, fancy way of saying book lover, bookworm, a classic car collector, and I do have 3 podcasts on cars from my car collection, so if you get a chance to see them, we were gonna do more, but it'll have to be after all this is over, former real estate developer, property renovator in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and I actually did that for a little while after I left teaching. A turning back struggler. That's my term, in traditional terms, recovering drug addict, and best of all, a volunteer, cat rescue shelter, chauffeur for cats in need of foster homes during a global pandemic. And, that's my favorite out of all of those, So, want to end this with thanks primarily to my former student, producer, editor. Without him, would never have any of these, and I wouldn't be able to keep doing them. So thank you to him for everything that he's done, Thanks to my analyst, as always, and we're still continuing remotely, but with not as good as the real thing, but it works, and thanks to the viewers, the relatively small. Well, I mean, we've had 10,000 views, total, but not a lot of subscribers. But I don't ask, and I haven't, and I won't. That's the difference between me and a lot of other podcasters. I've only got 32 subscribers. By the way, 32 is a mystical number. In James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, he talks about 32 being the number of the fall. It was how gravity was measured at 32 feet per second. But I've got 32 podcast, 32 viewer subscribers out of maybe 10,000 views. But I'm not going to ask. I don't do this for that. I do this for myself and the few hundred. I mean, each podcast is a few hundred. And if somebody finds it useful and helpful, as I said, I'm not suggesting my system to anyone else. And in a way, I've been very introverted. I've been very self-isolated. But introverts are kind of better adjusted now with all the stuff that's going on. So, the goal was to make them a little entertaining and a little informative. So I've been told, some of the feedback I've been getting is that they are slightly entertaining and slightly informative. So thanks to everyone who's been watching, and let's hope for another year at least of podcasts. So stay safe and add oil. Bye for now.